The words blur on my laptop screen, but it's not because I need new glasses. It's the rage. A white-hot, sickening rage that's coiling in my stomach, making the artisanal coffee I just sipped taste like ash. Professor Morrison, Dr. Elena Morrison, the same woman who called my debut novel Echoes in the Silence literary garbage that should never have seen print, is now teaching a masterclass on my best-selling techniques, my techniques. The audacity punches the air from my lungs. It's right there, plastered across a garishly designed webpage, the university's crest sitting smugly in the corner. Writing commercial fiction that sells lessons from Maya Chen's breakthrough success. $500. She's charging $500 for this intellectual grave robbing. My breath hitches, a painful snag in my chest. My hands, wrapped around the lukewarm mug, a custom one from my publisher with the space between words cover art, begin to tremble violently. The ceramic rattles faintly against the saucer, a tiny, tinny sound in the bustling coffee shop, but to me, it's a seismic event, the prelude to an earthquake of fury. The smooth, cool surface of the mug feels alien against my clammy palms. I scroll down, my jaw clenched so tight it aches, a dull throb radiating up to my temples. The course description is a masterpiece of hypocrisy, a tapestry woven from my own threads. It quotes extensively from The Space Between Words, my second novel, the one that hit #1, the one that proved her wrong. It talks about Chen's unique narrative drive, her masterful use of pacing to create unbearable suspense, the compelling, psychologically complex character arcs that resonate with millions. These are the very things Morrison once ripped apart in front of 20 MFA students, her voice dripping with derision, her lips curled in a sneer I can still picture with perfect, painful clarity. Formulaic dreck, she'd called it then. Transparently manipulative, designed to appeal to the lowest common denominator. The memory surges, sharp and cold, a phantom limb aching with remembered pain. I can almost smell the chalk dust and stale coffee of that workshop room, feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on me, judging, pitying. My heart hammers against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This isn't just academic analysis, this is Morrison dissecting my soul, my hard-won success, my sleepless nights and tear-stained drafts, and selling it piece by piece to the highest bidder. The betrayal is a physical thing, a shard of ice sliding down my throat, leaving a trail of numb cold. The smooth, dark wood of the table feels suddenly rough beneath my forearms, its polished surface reflecting my distorted, furious face. I can smell the burnt sugar notes from the barista's latest creation, a creme brulee latte, a scent I usually love that usually means comfort and focus, but now it's cloying, suffocating, like the sickly sweet smell of her insincere praise. Is everything okay, Maya? Leo, the owner of the Daily Grind, pauses by my table, his usually jovial face furrowed with concern. He's seen me through countless writing sessions here, from frantic first drafts fueled by triple-shot espressos to celebratory signings, where he insisted on providing free pastries for everyone. He knows my moods, my tells. I force a smile that feels like cracking plaster, like the fault lines appearing in my composure. Just wrestling with a new plot point, Leo. The villain is particularly audacious this time. My voice sounds strained, tight. He nods, his eyes kind, lingering for a moment. You'll figure it out, you always do. Need a refill on the house? No, thanks, Leo. I think this one needs a different kind of fuel. If only he knew, this villain isn't fictional, and the fuel I need is pure, unadulterated indignation. The discovery wrenches me back 5 years. The humiliation is still a raw, tender spot, a wound that never quite healed, just scarred over. My first book. My hopes, so bright and fragile. Shattered by her words, her academic standing, her undeniable influence in the literary world. The memory clings, a stubborn, bitter residue, like the dregs at the bottom of this now cold cup. That feeling of smallness, of utter worthlessness as she dismantled my work, sentence by painstaking sentence, in that sterile workshop room. The fluorescent lights hummed, a monotonous, oppressive sound magnifying my shame. The metallic tang of blood filled my mouth then, just as it does now, from biting the inside of my cheek too hard, a habit I thought I'd broken. But this is now. I'm not that trembling, tear-streaked girl anymore. My fingers still shaking, but now with purpose, fly across the trackpad. Quiet power move, screenshot, save, screenshot, save. I capture every word, every stolen phrase, every bit of Morrison's audacious thievery. The click of the screenshot command is a small, satisfying sound in the otherwise overwhelming noise of my anger. I create a new folder on my secure drive. Morrison, intellectual theft. Each saved image feels like a piece of armor clicking into place, a bullet loaded into a magazine. Outside, the Seattle drizzle has intensified into a proper downpour. Rain lashes against the large window of the daily grind, the drops like angry tears mirroring the storm building inside my chest. The cafe is a cacophony of sounds, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of conversations, the clatter of cups, a mournful jazz track playing softly. But all I hear is the echo of Morrison's voice, condescending and cruel. My latte is stone cold now, the bitterness on my tongue a perfect match for the fury churning within me. I take a defiant sip. It's awful, good. Let it fuel me. The acrid taste is a reminder. I need to think, to strategize. This isn't just about Morrison. A sickening realization dawns cold and sharp as a winter morning. If she's doing this so brazenly, leveraging her university position, who else is? Who else from that old guard, the ones who sneered at commercial success while secretly envying it, is dissecting my success, my journey, my very words, and turning them into a revenue stream? My gaze sweeps across the course webpage again, lingering on a testimonial. Professor Morrison's insights are unparalleled. She truly understands what makes contemporary fiction work. The testimonial is from a J. Whitmore literary critic. James Whitmore. My blood runs cold, a sudden Arctic frost in my veins. He wrote one of the most scathing, personally vicious reviews of Echoes in the Silence for Literary Quarterly, calling it a derivative, soulless piece of commercial fluff, an insult to the very notion of literature. He'd practically echoed Morrison's every criticism, almost as if they'd conferred. A quick search. My fingers fly across the keyboard, the keys clicking like angry castanets. There it is. James Whitmore, also offering a workshop through some online learning portal. Deconstructing the modern bestseller, How Genre Tropes Became Literary Gold, and whose book is featured prominently in his promotional material, the cover art mocked up next to his smug, bearded face? Mine. The space between words. The air in my lungs seems to evaporate. It's not just her, it's a pattern, a network. The anger that had been a focused beam now explodes, a blinding nova, obliterating thought for a heart-stopping moment. They tried to bury me, and now they're feasting on what grew from the ashes. A chilling laugh escapes me, devoid of humor, drawing a curious glance from the woman at the next table. I ignore her. They have no idea what they've just started. This isn't just about copyright or intellectual property, though my lawyer will have a field day. This is about reclaiming my story, my voice, from the very people who tried to silence it. My phone buzzes. A message from my agent, Chloe, probably about the upcoming European book tour logistics. I silence it with a vicious stab of my thumb. The tour can wait. This can't. The rain continues to fall, a relentless drumming, like the beat of a war drum calling me to arms. And I, Maya Chen, am preparing for battle. The world outside the coffee shop window is a blur of gray, indistinct and weeping, but in my mind, the path forward is suddenly terribly clear, illuminated by the fires of my rage. The rhythmic drumming of rain against the coffee shop window fades, replaced by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. My mind, unbidden, spirals back, pulling me through 5 years of carefully constructed defenses back to 2019. I was 25, a hopeful MFA student, convinced my words could change the world, or at least touch a few hearts. Echoes in the Silence was my thesis, my baby. A story I'd poured every ounce of my being into. It was about grief, about finding connection in unexpected places. I thought it was good. I thought it was important. Then came Professor Morrison's workshop. Dr. Elena Morrison, with her sharp bob and even sharper pronouncements, was the doyenne of the literary fiction program. Her approval was the holy grail. I'd submitted my first 3 chapters with trembling anticipation. Her critique began mildly enough, a few comments on sentence structure, a query about a character's motivation. Then the scalpel came out. No, not a scalpel, a sledgehammer. "Miss Chen," she'd said, her voice echoing slightly in the hushed room, her gaze sweeping over the other 19 students before settling on me like a bird of prey. "While there's a certain facility with language here, the core of this work is, frankly, troubling." Troubling, I remember my brow furrowing. "It's formulaic dreck," she declared, the words landing like physical blows. My cheeks burned. I could feel the blood draining from my face, the heat replaced by a spreading, icy numbness. Designed to appeal to the lowest common denominator. The emotional beats are telegraphed, the plot predictable. This isn't literature, Miss Chen. This is sentimentality dressed up in slightly more sophisticated prose. She paused, letting the venom sink in. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the rustle of someone's papers. I stared at my manuscript, the black ink suddenly looking like a swarm of accusing insects. The smell of old paper and floor wax in that university room felt heavy, oppressive. I'd wanted to disappear, to melt into the cheap linoleum floor. Tears pricked at my eyes, hot and shameful. I bit down hard on my lip, the metallic taste of blood, sharp and coppery, flooding my mouth. It was a small, secret pain, a desperate anchor in the storm of her words. The other students avoided my gaze, some with pity, others, I suspected, with a touch of smug relief that it wasn't them in the crosshairs. One of them, Mark, who always seemed to be Morrison's pet, actually nodded in agreement. That small gesture somehow cut deeper. "You have potential, Miss Chen," Morrison continued, her tone suggesting the opposite. "But you need to dig deeper. Eschew these cheap narrative tricks. Challenge your reader. Don't coddle them." She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail blood red, I recall, on my manuscript. "This, as it stands, is a betrayal of that potential." The workshop ended. I stumbled out in a daze, her words echoing in my head. Formulaic dreck, lowest common denominator, cheap narrative tricks. My manuscript felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. That was the first destruction. The pile-on effect was swift and brutal. Echoes in the silence had, against the odds, secured a modest deal with a small, independent press. The advance was barely enough to cover rent for 3 months, but it was a validation, or so I thought. When the advance reviews started trickling in, it was clear Morrison's sentiment had somehow permeated the literary ether. James Whitmore in Literary Quarterly called it a derivative, soulless piece of commercial fluff. Sarah Chen, no relation, but the shared surname felt like a cruel joke from Bookworld, dismissed it as a saccharine melodrama better suited for a forgettable afternoon television movie. Their words, echoing Morrison's, were like salt rubbed into an open wound. The bitter taste of defeat became a constant companion. The emotional devastation was absolute. My publisher, citing the disastrous reviews and non-existent pre-orders, reduced the print run and pulled all marketing support. My agent, a bright young woman who'd initially been so enthusiastic, called me, her voice strained with apology. "Maya, I don't think I can represent this book effectively anymore, and perhaps we're not the right fit." She abandoned me. Sales, when the book finally limped onto shelves, plummeted to a pathetic 247 copies. I knew the exact number because I'd obsessively checked, torturing myself. Each unsold copy felt like a personal rejection. The world I had dreamed of entering, the literary community I yearned to be a part of, had slammed its doors in my face, loudly and unequivocally. I remember one particularly bleak Tuesday afternoon. The royalty statement had arrived, a single sheet of paper showing a negative balance after the minuscule advance. It was raining then, too, a miserable, gray sheet of water that matched the landscape of my soul. I walked into my tiny studio apartment bathroom, the chipped tiles cold under my bare feet. The reflection in the cracked mirror was a stranger hollow-eyed, pale, defeated. And then, I just collapsed. The physical breakdown was as complete as the emotional one. I lay there, sobbing, the cold, unforgiving tile pressed against my cheek, the salty taste of tears mixing with the phantom tang of blood in my mouth. The world was a symphony of pain, sharp and dull, relentless. The rough texture of the cheap bath mat was an abrasive reminder of how far I had fallen. But even then, even at my absolute lowest, a tiny, stubborn ember refused to be extinguished. Quiet power move, I kept writing, in secret. After the tears dried, after the initial paralysis of despair wore off, I opened my laptop. Not to revise echoes that felt like touching a live wire, but to start something new. Something born of that pain, that anger, that defiance. I didn't know what it would be, only that I had to write. Writing was breathing, and I was suffocating. The rhythmic clicking of the keys in the dead of night, illuminated only by the glow of the screen, became my lifeline. It was during those clandestine writing sessions, fueled by cheap instant coffee and an almost pathological need to prove them wrong, that the realization began to dawn. Morrison's critique, Whitmore's barbs, Chen's dismissal, they had all focused on the very elements that, in my gut, I knew made a story compelling. The strong narrative drive she called formulaic. The emotional resonance she termed sentimentality. The clear, accessible prose she implied was for the lowest common denominator. What if they weren't weaknesses? What if they were, in fact, strengths, if wielded with skill and heart? What if my authentic voice wasn't the problem, but their outdated, elitist definition of literature was? The thought was a tiny spark, but I fanned it. I gave myself 1 year. 1 year to write something that would prove I wasn't the failure they'd branded me. 1 year to claw my way back. The ticking clock was a relentless pressure, each day a grain of sand slipping through the hourglass. I wrote with a feverish intensity, pouring all my frustration, all my hurt, all my desperate hope onto the page. The manuscript grew, page by painstaking page. I was living like a hermit, surviving on ramen and sheer willpower. The city outside my window hummed with life, but I was in my own world, a world of words and shadows, wrestling with my demons and my characters. Then, just as the self-imposed deadline loomed, just as the despair was beginning to creep back in, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line was innocuous, query your work. The sender was an editor I didn't recognize from a press I'd vaguely heard of. Rachel Martinez, Phoenix Press. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, another rejection in a new guise. But something made me click it open. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, frantic drumbeat of hope against the silence of my solitude. The words she wrote would change everything. Rachel Martinez. The name sounded vaguely Spanish, and Phoenix Press was hardly a household name, but her email, concise and direct, cut through the fog of my despair. Dear Miss Chen, it began, I recently came across a sample of your early work, Echoes in the Silence, through some less conventional channels. While I understand it wasn't a commercial success, I found the voice compelling and the emotional core undeniably powerful. I am an editor at Phoenix Press, a new imprint focused on championing unique voices in fiction. I'd be very interested to know if you are currently working on anything new. Underground literary circles? What did that even mean? It sounded like something out of a spy novel. My first instinct was suspicion. Was this some cruel prank? A new way for the literary world to mock me? But the tone of the email felt genuine, and the phrase undeniably powerful echoed in my mind. A balm to a wound I thought would never heal. Hope, that treacherous emotion flickered within me. I replied cautiously, attaching the first 50 pages of the manuscript I'd been secretly, obsessively crafting in the dark. The one I hadn't dared show anyone. The one where I'd leaned into everything Morrison had decried. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark. I expected silence, or at best, a polite rejection. Rachel Martinez replied within 24 hours. Maya, she wrote, the formality already softened. This is extraordinary. Send me everything you have, immediately. Extraordinary, the word vibrated on the screen. It was the antithesis of formulaic dreck. Phoenix Press, I soon learned, was a risky gamble itself. A small, independent publisher started by a group of editors who'd grown disillusioned with the risk-averse nature of the big houses. Rachel Martinez, its driving force, was a firebrand. In our first video call, her passion was infectious. Her dark eyes blazed with conviction as she spoke. Maya, what you have here, This is the future. This is accessible literary fiction. It has depth, it has heart, but it also has drive. It's what readers are starving for, whether the gatekeepers realize it or not. She saw my commercial style not as a flaw, but as a strength, a bridge between worlds. She wasn't just offering me a contract, she was offering me a lifeline, a resurrection. The emotional rebirth was gradual, then sudden. With Rachel's unwavering belief as my shield, I emerged from my self-imposed literary exile. Stronger, more determined, and angrier in a focused, productive way. The secret writing, once a furtive act of defiance, became a mission. I wasn't just writing for myself anymore. I was writing for Rachel, for Phoenix Press, for every writer who'd been told their voice wasn't literary enough. The writing process became a blur of disciplined fury. I remember the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard late into the night, the only sound in my tiny apartment, a counterpoint to the distant city sirens. The apartment constantly smelled of countless cups of cheap, bitter coffee, the nectar of the damned and the determined. My desk was a chaotic landscape of worn notebook pages, filled with frantic scribbles, character maps, plot twists. The texture of those cheap, thin pages under my fingers, the way the ink bled slightly, became talismans. I'd sleep for 4 hours, wake up with a line of dialogue burning in my brain, and stumble back to the keyboard, the cold floor a shock to my bare feet. I was a machine, fueled by caffeine and indignation. It was during one of these late-night sessions, staring at a particularly knotty plot point, that the breakthrough moment arrived. It wasn't a lightning bolt, but a quiet, dawning realization. My authentic voice was never the problem. It wasn't lowest common denominator. It was simply ahead of its time. Or, more accurately, out of sync with the narrow, self-congratulatory tastes of the academic and critical elite. Morrison hadn't been critiquing my writing. She'd been defending her turf, her definition of what mattered. The realization was liberating. It unshackled me from the ghost of her disapproval. With this newfound clarity, I made a conscious decision. Quiet power move. I deliberately wove into the fabric of my new novel, which I was now calling The Space Between Words, every single element Professor Morrison had specifically attacked in echoes in the silence. Strong, propulsive plotting? Check. Characters who experienced and expressed deep, sometimes messy emotions? Double check. A narrative that aimed for both emotional impact and intellectual engagement without apology? Absolutely. I wasn't just reclaiming my voice, I was weaponizing it. Each flaw she'd pointed out became a cornerstone of the new book. One evening, during a particularly intense editing call with Rachel, her insights were as sharp as Morrison's, but constructive, aimed at elevating the work, not demolishing the writer. She paused. "You know, Maya," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I get it. What you went through. I was on the receiving end of that kind underscore of gatekeeping for years. Told my taste was too commercial. That I didn't get serious literature because I championed books people actually wanted to read. The plot twist wasn't in my novel, it was in my editor's confession. Rachel wasn't just an editor, she was a fellow survivor. That revelation forged an even deeper bond between us. We weren't just publishing a book, we were launching a quiet rebellion. When The Space Between Words was finally complete, polished to a sheen by our combined efforts, Rachel announced her plan. She was taking it to auction. "This book is too big for us to launch quietly, Maya," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "The world needs to see this, and they need to pay for it." The manuscript went out to the top 5 publishing houses. The response was electric. Within days, 3 major publishers were in a bidding war. The offers climbed, figures that made my head spin. I remember sitting in Rachel's tiny, cluttered office at Phoenix Press, the air thick with the smell of old books and new hope, watching the bids come in on her laptop. Each new email made my heart leap. The numbers were surreal, life-changing. The auction was set to close on a Friday at 5 p.m. We had 3 staggering offers on the table. Rachel looked at me, her smile wide. "You have 48 hours to decide, Maya. 48 hours to choose who gets to bring your masterpiece to the world." It was an impossible, wonderful choice. The ticking clock of the deadline felt less like pressure and more like the countdown to a rocket launch. I felt dizzy, elated. terrified. Then, at 4:58 p.m., just 2 minutes before the auction was due to close, Rachel's phone buzzed with an alert. A new email. Her eyes widened as she read it. She looked up at me, speechless for a moment, a rare occurrence. "Maya," she whispered, her voice hoarse with disbelief. "You're not going to believe this. An unexpected bidder, a major one." The name she uttered made the breath catch in my throat. It was the last publisher I ever would have expected. "Aurora Publishing," Rachel breathed, her eyes still wide with shock. "They want in. They're making a preemptive offer." Aurora Publishing. The name echoed in the small office, heavy with prestige and literary authority. They were the oldest, the most revered, the house that published Nobel laureates and Pulitzer Prize winners. They were everything Professor Morrison and her ilk aspired to, the very definition of serious literature. And they wanted my book? The book that was a direct, deliberate refutation of everything Morrison stood for? The irony was so thick, so delicious I could almost taste it like the finest dark chocolate after years of bitter pills. The air crackled with an almost unbearable tension. Their offer wasn't just a bid, it was a statement. A seven-figure advance that dwarfed the others, coupled with a marketing commitment that promised to make the space between words a global phenomenon. It was the kind of validation that silenced all doubts, all whispers of inadequacy. This wasn't just about money. It was about acceptance on my own terms, by the very establishment that had once shunned me. The decision, which had seemed agonizingly complex moments before, became blindingly simple. "We accept," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, the words tasting like victory. Rachel let out a whoop of joy, grabbing my hands and spinning me around her tiny office, scattering piles of manuscripts. The launch of The Space Between Words was everything Aurora promised and more. The book debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for 16 weeks. It was an instant classic, a cultural phenomenon. My face was on magazine covers, my voice on radio waves, my story splashed across morning talk shows. The sensory triumph was overwhelming. My apartment, once a refuge of solitude and secret writing, was now constantly filled with the sweet, heady smell of fresh flowers, bouquets sent by my publisher, my agent, a new, much more powerful one, and even by readers. My phone buzzed incessantly, a relentless symphony of congratulations, interview requests, and messages from old friends I hadn't heard from in years. The sound, once a source of anxiety, now felt like a warm embrace. But the sweetest vindication came from the critics. The very same critics who had gleefully destroyed echoes in the silence now fell over themselves to praise the space between words. James Whitmore, in Literary Quarterly, lauded its innovative approach to contemporary fiction, seamlessly blending genre propulsion with profound character study. Sarah Chen, in Bookworld, hailed it as a groundbreaking novel that redefines the boundaries of literary and commercial fiction. Their hypocrisy was breathtaking, but I felt a grim satisfaction rather than anger. They weren't just reviewing a book. They were acknowledging a paradigm shift, a changing of the guard. And I was at the forefront of it. I held the physical copy of The Space Between Words in my hands, its weight substantial, its cover art a stark, beautiful image we'd fought for, cool beneath my fingertips. This was it, the culmination of years of pain, struggle, and unwavering belief. The weight of vindication was a palpable thing, settling deep in my bones, a quiet, unshakable strength. During the whirlwind of media attention, I became the literary world's newest darling. I was invited to speak at major book festivals, to give keynote addresses, to sit on panels with authors I had idolized from afar. Quiet power move. In every interview, on every stage, I spoke about the importance of authentic storytelling, of writing the stories that burned within you, regardless of prevailing literary fashions. But I never once mentioned Professor Morrison or the critics who had tried to destroy my first book. Their names never crossed my lips. My success was my statement. Their silence, their scramble to align themselves with my triumph, was their shame. Then the email arrived. From Elena Morrison, the subject line, "Congratulations!" My blood ran cold for a moment, then hot with a familiar surge of anger. She congratulated me on my remarkable success, on the richness and complexity of the space between words. She spoke of my evolution as a writer, as if she were a proud mentor observing a protege's flourishing. There was no mention of our past, no hint of apology, no acknowledgement of the pain she had inflicted. It was a masterpiece of oblivious arrogance, or perhaps calculated revisionism. I stared at the email, the words blurring. The sheer audacity of it left me breathless. I didn't reply. What was there to say? But her email was a harbinger. Slowly, subtly, I started noticing something else. Academic papers began to appear, dissecting the Chen narrative style. Literary journals discussed the innovative techniques pioneered in the space between words. University course descriptions started referencing my novel as a key text in contemporary fiction. At first, I felt a flush of pride. This was what I dreamed of. My work being taken seriously, studied, discussed, and then the screenshots and links began to pour in, sent by friends, by my agent, by concerned readers. A colleague from my MFA days, one of the few who had been kind, sent me a link with a simple message. Maya, you need to see this. Unbelievable. It was a link to Professor Elena Morrison's new online course, offered through a prominent continuing education platform. Writing commercial fiction that sells lessons from Maya Chen's breakthrough success. The course description was lifted, almost verbatim in places, from interviews I had given, from craft essays I had published, from the very heart of my storytelling philosophy. She was teaching my techniques, the techniques she had once savaged, and she was charging a premium for it. The discovery I'm reliving right now in this coffee shop, the fury, the betrayal, the evidence mounted with sickening speed. James Whitmore was offering a similar workshop. Sarah Chen was hosting a webinar series on the new adult realism, citing my work as the primary example. It wasn't just influence, it was appropriation. It was theft, dressed up in academic jargon. The realization that this was a widespread phenomenon, a systematic monetization of my hard-won success by the very people who had tried to prevent it, hit me with the force of a physical blow. My new agent, Chloe Sterling, a shark in Chanel, was already on the warpath, her voice crackling with indignation over the phone. This is outrageous, Maya. Copyright infringement, intellectual property theft, defamation. We're going to nail them to the wall. But a new, more chilling piece of information surfaced, delivered by a frantic email from Rachel. Professor Morrison hadn't just created an online course. She had secured a major publishing deal for a book about my work. The working title, according to the publisher's catalog, The Chen Method, Unlocking the Secrets of Maya Chen's Revolutionary Storytelling Techniques. The air left my lungs. This wasn't just a course. This was a blatant attempt to codify and claim ownership of my creative DNA. And it was being published by a reputable house. The ticking clock wasn't just for Morrison's online course launch anymore. It was for the publication of a book that threatened to erase my own narrative, to reframe my success as her discovery. The audacity was boundless. The fight had just escalated to a whole new level. The initial shock solidified into a cold, hard fury. Morrison wasn't just teaching a course, she was trying to build an academic empire on my back. Her upcoming book, The Chen Method, was the ultimate act of appropriation. This wasn't about flattery or academic discourse anymore. This was about intellectual theft, pure and simple. My hand tightened around my coffee cup, the ceramic groaning under the pressure. The metallic taste of anger, sharp and bitter, was back in my mouth. We need to be smart about this, Maya. Chloe's voice was crisp and businesslike over the phone later that day. She'd already been in touch with a top-tier intellectual property lawyer. Outrage is good. It's fuel. But we need a strategy, not just a firestorm. I agreed, though every fiber of my being screamed for immediate, explosive confrontation. Instead, I channeled that fire. Quiet power move. I hired a digital forensics expert, a recommendation from Chloe's lawyer, a woman named Anya Sharma, who specialized in tracking online plagiarism and intellectual property violations. Anya was a ghost in the machine, a digital bloodhound. Her brief was simple: find out exactly how extensively my work was being plagiarized, by whom and where. The results of Anya's initial sweep, delivered a week later in a detailed, heavily encrypted report, were shocking. The scope of the plagiarism was far wider than I'd imagined. It wasn't just Morrison and Whitmore, it was a network, a loose confederation of academics, critics, and self-proclaimed writing gurus, all dissecting, repackaging, and monetizing my techniques across multiple platforms. Online courses, webinars, exclusive masterclasses, even self-published ebooks. Anya's report was a spiderweb of links, screenshots, and verbatim quotes, all tracing back to my interviews, my essays, my novels. The sheer scale of it made me feel dizzy, violated. The sound of my own fingers drumming impatiently on my mahogany desk was the only sound in my otherwise silent office, a restless rhythm of mounting frustration. Morrison's transgressions were the most blatant. Her online course curriculum, which Anya managed to access, was a cut-and-paste job of epic proportions. Entire modules were structured around my specific plot devices, character archetypes, and even my revision processes, all presented as her discoveries or interpretations. She'd lifted phrases, sentences, entire paragraphs from my published interviews and craft talks, passing them off as her own insights. The betrayal burned anew, hotter this time, fed by the irrefutable proof. My emotional rage, which had simmered after the initial discovery, now boiled over, transforming from a sense of personal hurt into a calculated ice-cold fury. This was a declaration of war. "This is astounding," Diana Ross said, peering at Anya's report through her chic, black-rimmed glasses. Not the Diana Ross, as she always clarified with a wry smile, but an IP lawyer with a reputation for being just as formidable. We were in her sleek, minimalist office, the city skyline a glittering, indifferent backdrop. The brazenness is something else. "Can we sue them all into oblivion?" I asked, my voice tight. Diana steepled her fingers. "Suing is an option, certainly for direct copyright infringement of your published words. But protecting techniques or style is notoriously difficult, Maya. Ideas are free, as they say. It's the expression of ideas that's protected." She explained the nuances, the challenges, the sheer cost and time involved in fighting multiple battles on multiple fronts. Morrison's book, however, if it's as derivative as her course material, that's a clearer target. We can definitely send a very strong cease and desist there, and to the publisher. Strategic planning. It was less satisfying than envisioning a courtroom inferno, but far more effective. While Diana and her team prepared the legal volleys, I focused on a different front. Quiet power move. I began building a public case through social media, not an outright attack, not yet. But subtle posts, carefully worded tweets, sharing articles about artistic integrity, about the difference between influence and appropriation. I highlighted quotes from my own past interviews about my writing process, letting my words speak for themselves, planting seeds of doubt about the originality of those now teaching my methods. The scent of the expensive orchids in Diana's office, usually calming, seemed to mock the ugliness of the situation. As news of my quiet offensive spread through online writing communities, something unexpected happened. Other writers started coming forward, privately at first, then more openly. They shared their own stories of academic critiques that felt more like personal attacks, of influential figures who dismissed their work only to later incorporate their unique approaches into their own teachings or writings. The network Anya had exposed wasn't just preying on me, it was a systemic pattern of gatekeeping and exploitation. This was bigger than Morrison. This was about the soul of the literary community. My anger found a new focus. This wasn't just my fight anymore. I pulled out my old journals, the ones I'd filled during the dark days after echoes in the silence had been destroyed. The raw pain scrawled across those pages, the tear stains blurring the ink, connected me to these other writers, to their shared experience of being dismissed, devalued, and then plundered. The texture of those old, brittle pages felt like a conduit to that past self, and I vowed she wouldn't be the last writer to suffer this. Anya's latest update landed in my inbox with a grim thud. Morrison's online course was set to launch in 2 weeks. 200 students had already pre-enrolled, each paying $500. That was $100,000 made from my intellectual property, my sweat, my tears. The ticking clock was deafening. We needed to act and act fast. Diana's team fired off the cease and desist letters, meticulously detailing the copyright infringements in Morrison's course materials and her forthcoming book. The letters were masterpieces of legal menace, polite, yet utterly ruthless. We waited. The response when it came was not what I expected. It wasn't a conciliatory email or a request for discussion. It was a letter on thick, expensive bond paper from a high-powered law firm I recognized as one of the most aggressive in the country. It was a cease and desist letter, addressed to me, accusing me of harassment, of defamation, of attempting to stifle academic freedom. My jaw dropped. Morrison wasn't just fighting back. She was going on the offensive, trying to silence me before I could expose her. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it stole my breath. The battle lines were drawn, and Professor Morrison, it seemed, was prepared to burn everything to the ground, including her own reputation, to win. Morrison's cease and desist letter was a declaration of war. Her lawyers, a pack of notoriously aggressive sharks, claimed I had no ownership over general writing techniques, and that Professor Morrison's course constituted fair use for educational purposes and valid academic commentary. They painted me as a vindictive, overly sensitive author trying to stifle legitimate scholarly discussion. The letter was filled with legal jargon designed to intimidate, to make me back down. For a moment, a flicker of the old fear, the memory of being powerless against her pronouncements, resurfaced. My palms felt clammy. "Don't let them get to you, Maya," Diana said, her voice calm and steady when I called her, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and anxiety. "This is a classic bully tactic. They're trying to scare you into silence. It means we've hit a nerve." Her words were like a splash of cold water. She was right. This wasn't a sign of their strength, but of their desperation. The legal warfare would be protracted, expensive, and emotionally draining. Morrison knew that. She was counting on me to fold. She underestimated me. Badly. "Diana," I said, my voice hardening with resolve, "what if we pivot? The courts will take months, maybe years. Her course launches in less than 2 weeks. Her book is on an accelerated schedule. We need to win in the court of public opinion, now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Diana chuckled, a low, appreciative sound. "I like the way you think, Maya. A strategic pivot, force her hand, yes, let's do it." That evening, I sat at my desk, the city lights twinkling beyond my window like 1,000 watching eyes. The constant ping of notifications on my phone, usually a distraction, was silenced. I needed focus. Quiet power move, I crafted a Twitter thread. Not a rant, not an emotional outburst, but a meticulously constructed, evidence-backed exposé of Professor Morrison's hypocrisy and plagiarism. I laid out the timeline. Her scathing dismissal of my debut novel, the specific techniques she had attacked, and then, side by side, screenshots of her course materials and book proposal, showing her now championing those exact same techniques, often using my own words as her insights. I included links to her old reviews of my work and to the promotional material for her new ventures. I kept the tone measured, factual, more in sorrow than in anger, though the sorrow was a thin veneer over a core of molten fury. I ended the thread with a simple question. Is this academic freedom, or is it intellectual theft and blatant hypocrisy? You decide. I hit tweet. The response was instantaneous and explosive. The thread went viral within hours. 50,000 retweets, hundreds of thousands of likes. The author community in particular erupted in a firestorm of support for me and outrage against Morrison. Hashtags like #MorrisonMethodScam and #HandsOffMaya's started trending. Major literary publications, blogs, and even some mainstream news outlets picked up the story. My phone, which I'd silenced, started vibrating so intensely on the desk it looked like it was having a seizure. The sensory overwhelm was immense. The relentless cascade of notifications, the heat of the sudden, intense viral attention, the dizzying pace of messages, DMs, emails flooding in. It was terrifying and exhilarating. Professor Morrison, clearly caught off guard by the ferocity of the public backlash, released a defensive statement through her university's PR department. It was a masterpiece of academic obfuscation, claiming literary influence is a complex process, that her work was merely engaging in a critical dialogue with contemporary literary phenomena, and that my unfounded accusations were an attempt to chill legitimate scholarly inquiry. She didn't deny using my work, she just reframed it as her intellectual right. It was a weak defense, and the public saw right through it. Quiet power move. I responded with surgical precision. I posted a follow up tweet. Influence is one thing. Verbatim lifting of phrasing and structure, alongside a complete reversal of prior public condemnation without acknowledgement, is another. Here are some more side by side comparisons. And I provided them. More screenshots. More irrefutable evidence. The floodgates opened. Emboldened by my stand, other authors began to share their own stories of critical destruction, followed by technique appropriation, naming names, providing receipts. It became clear this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of behavior by a certain segment of the academic and critical establishment. The narrative I had started was no longer just mine. It was a collective roar. The emotional momentum was palpable. I felt the power of truth, amplified by 1,000 voices. And for the first time, I truly believed Morrison could be stopped. The pressure on the institutions supporting Morrison mounted rapidly. Her university, facing a PR nightmare and calls from alumni to investigate, announced they were launching a formal review of her course materials and her conduct. The online platform hosting her course, bombarded with complaints and negative reviews, put the course under review, effectively pausing new enrollments. Corporate accountability, it turned out, could be a powerful weapon when wielded by a united public. Then, Chloe called, her voice tight with urgency. Maya, Morrison is going on the Literati Lounge podcast tomorrow. It's one of the biggest literary podcasts out there. She's going to try and control the narrative, paint herself as the victim. The Literati Lounge, hosted by Arthur Finch, a man known for his fawning interviews with established literary figures and his disdain for anything he considered populist. Morrison was clearly hoping for a friendly audience, a platform to discredit me. The ticking clock was now less than 24 hours. She was going to try and spin this, to salvage her reputation, to turn the tables back on me. Just as I was about to dive into preparing a counter-response, my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Maya Chen? The voice was hesitant, strained, instantly recognizable. Professor Morrison, I said, my voice cold. Maya, Dr. Chen, she corrected herself, a tremor in her voice I'd never heard before. I need to speak with you, privately, before this podcast. Can we meet? My mind raced. A private meeting? Now? What was she playing at? Was it a trap? A desperate plea, or something else entirely? The request hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. A cliffhanger in my own unfolding drama. The request for a meeting was a curveball. My gut screamed trap, but a deeper, colder part of me, the part that had been nursing this wound for 5 long years, saw an opportunity. Where and when, Professor? I kept my voice devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside. She suggested the daily grind, the coffee shop where this whole new nightmare had begun just weeks ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Perhaps she thought the familiar, neutral territory would disarm me. Or perhaps it was a subtle power play, taking me back to a place of vulnerability. She was wrong on both counts. I arrived first, choosing a small table in the corner, a clear view of the entrance, my back to the wall. The familiar scent of roasted coffee beans and baked goods, usually a comfort, now felt like the backdrop to a duel. The low hum of conversations, the clinking of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, it all seemed amplified, charged with an unspoken tension. My heart hammered a steady, determined rhythm against my ribs. I ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no milk, just bitter, like my mood. Professor Morrison walked in precisely at the agreed-upon time, a little after the lunch rush. She looked smaller than I remembered from the lecture hall, from the pedestal of her authority. Her sharp bob seemed less severe, her expensive tailored suit a little rumpled. There were dark circles under her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite conceal. She clutched her handbag like a shield. For a fleeting second, I almost felt a sliver of, not pity, but something akin to it. Then I remembered the years of pain, the public humiliation, the blatant theft. The sliver vanished. She sat opposite me, avoiding my direct gaze for a moment, her eyes scanning the cafe as if looking for an escape route. "Thank you for meeting me, Maya," she began, her voice low, almost a whisper. The tremor was still there. "I'm here to listen, Professor," I said, my tone flat. "Though I imagine your lawyers have advised you against this." A flicker of something annoyance, fear, crossed her face. "My lawyers, yes. Well, this has all gotten so out of hand." "Has it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or has it simply come to light?" She finally met my eyes, and I saw not the imperious academic, but a cornered animal. "Maya, you have to understand. My course, my book. It was never my intention to steal from you." "Then what precisely was your intention, Professor?" "When you lifted my words, my structures, my entire creative philosophy, and presented it as your own groundbreaking analysis? When you charged $500 for it? When you planned to publish a book titled The Chen Method?" My voice was quiet, but it vibrated with controlled fury. The air between us crackled. Her justification, when it came, was a torrent of self-serving rationalizations. She was democratizing my techniques, she claimed, making them accessible to aspiring writers who couldn't afford expensive MFA programs. She was building upon my work, engaging in scholarly interpretation. She was, in her own mind, performing a public service. The bitter smell of my black coffee seemed to intensify, mirroring the acrid taste of her excuses. I let her speak, my expression unreadable. Then, when she finally paused, searching my face for some sign of understanding, of absolution, I unleashed. Not in a shout, not in a scream, but in a low, steady torrent of words that carried the weight of 5 years of suppressed pain, anger, and humiliation. I recounted the workshop, her exact words, the way they had shattered my confidence. I described the professional fallout, the personal despair. I detailed the painstaking process of rebuilding my career, of finding my voice again, only to see her attempt to co-opt it, to claim it. The tremor was in my voice now, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the emotion I was finally allowing myself to express directly to her. "You didn't just criticize my work, Professor," I said, my voice raw. "You tried to destroy me, and now you're trying to profit from the very thing you sought to annihilate. There's a word for that. It's not scholarship. It's not democratization. It's theft. It's hypocrisy. It's a betrayal of every principle you claim to uphold." She flinched as if struck. Her carefully constructed composure began to crumble. And then, the most astonishing thing happened. Professor Elena Morrison, the Iron Lady of literary criticism, began to cry. Not dramatic sobs, but silent, weary tears that traced paths through her expensive foundation. I knew," she choked out, the words ragged. "Your first book, Echoes. I knew it had something. It was raw, yes, a little unpolished, but it was alive. It was the kind of writing that connects with readers on a visceral level." I stared at her, stunned into silence. This was not what I expected. "And that scared me," she whispered, looking down at her tightly clasped hands. "It scared me because it wasn't what I valued, what I'd built my career on. It threatened the canon, the definitions of a literary that we had spent decades curating. So I attacked it. It was easier to dismiss it, to label it commercial, than to confront the possibility that the literary landscape was changing and I was being left behind." Her confession hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Quiet power move. My fingers subtly activated the recording app on my phone, nestled in my lap. I'd come prepared. She had, after all, just admitted to professional malpractice, to a deliberate act of sabotage fueled by fear and jealousy. She looked up, her eyes pleading. "I am sorry, Maya, for the pain I caused you then, and for this mess." Her apology, though tearful, felt hollow, more like damage control than genuine remorse. The timing was too convenient, her back against the wall. "An apology isn't enough, Professor," I said, my voice regaining its steel. You need to make a full public acknowledgement of your actions. Retract your course, cancel your book deal, issue a formal public apology to me, admitting to the appropriation of my work and the unjust critique of my first novel. I laid out my terms, clear and non-negotiable. That, or we proceed with full legal warfare. And trust me, after your little confession here, my lawyers will have a field day. The psychological victory was immense. In that moment, I realized her power over me. The power she had wielded for so long had completely, utterly evaporated. I saw her not as a formidable intellectual giant, but as a frightened, insecure woman clinging to a crumbling edifice of authority. The ghost of my younger, wounded self, the girl who had wept on a cold bathroom tile, finally felt heard, finally felt vindicated. Morrison's face paled. The desperation in her eyes was stark. "Maya, please," she stammered. "My university. They're investigating. My reputation. I'm facing financial ruin, academic censure. I could lose everything." "You should have thought of that," I said, my voice devoid of sympathy, "before you decided to build your comeback on my career." I stood up. "You have 24 hours to publicly correct the record. 24 hours to do the right thing. After that, all bets are off." She stared at me, her mouth agape, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Then, her expression hardened, a flicker of the old arrogance returning. She rose, her movements jerky. "You think you've won, don't you, Miss Chen?" she hissed, her voice regaining some of its former venom. "This isn't over. I will not be destroyed by a populist peddler of melodrama. I'll find a way. I'll destroy your reputation. Permanently." She turned and stormed out of the coffee shop, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and the bitter taste of her threats. The confrontation was over, but the war, it seemed, had just entered its most dangerous phase. Professor Morrison, true to her threat, didn't use her 24 hours to issue an apology. Instead, she went on the Literati Lounge podcast with Arthur Finch, armed for her last stand. I listened to the live stream from my apartment, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach despite my outward resolve. The familiar buttery tones of Finch introduced her as a distinguished scholar under siege by the forces of online outrage. Morrison launched into a defensive tirade. She portrayed herself as a victim of a cancel culture witch hunt, a dedicated academic being persecuted for daring to engage critically with a popular author. She claimed my work was public domain for analysis, and that my accusations were a gross mischaracterization of scholarly engagement. She was articulate, forceful, and utterly unrepentant. She even had the audacity to suggest I was orchestrating the backlash to generate publicity for my next book. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it was breathtaking. The heat rose in my cheeks as I listened, my fingers clenching into fists. But her aggressive, self-pitying performance backfired. Spectacularly. Finch, clearly a sympathizer, tried to guide her, but Morrison, in her arrogance, overplayed her hand. Listeners weren't buying it. The live comments section on the podcast's webpage was a torrent of disbelief and condemnation. "She sounds unhinged. Is she seriously playing the victim card after plagiarizing? Arthur Finch should be ashamed for giving her this platform." The backfire effect was swift and brutal. She hadn't controlled the narrative, she'd doused her own reputation in gasoline and lit a match. While she was still spewing her venom on air, Chloe and I, with Diana's legal blessing, uploaded my response. Quiet power move. It wasn't a tweet storm this time, but a short, thoughtful, measured video. Me speaking directly to the camera from my own living room, calm and composed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sling mud. I simply laid out the facts, presented the evidence, including a carefully edited, legally sound audio snippet of her confession from the coffee shop meeting, focusing on her admission of her motives for attacking Echoes, and expressed my disappointment that a respected academic would stoop to such levels. I reiterated my belief in constructive criticism, but condemned plagiarism and hypocrisy. I ended by saying I hoped this situation would lead to a broader, more honest conversation about ethics in the literary world. The video went viral almost as quickly as my initial Twitter thread, but this time, the tone of the public response was less about outrage and more about a profound, weary disappointment in Morrison and a wave of respect for my measured approach. The institutional consequences for Morrison were swift. Within days, her university, citing conduct unbecoming of a tenured professor and potential ethical and academic integrity violations, suspended her pending the outcome of their full investigation. The online platform hosting her course, which had already paused enrollments, permanently removed the course, issuing refunds to all enrolled students and a public apology for their lack of oversight. The publisher of her proposed book, The Chen Method, announced they were reevaluating the project, a publishing euphemism for killing it dead. My phone, which had been buzzing with a mixture of angry and supportive messages, now sang with a chorus of unadulterated support from around the world. The messages were from readers, fellow writers, even some academics who praised my courage in speaking out. The sensory victory was no longer just the absence of attack, but the presence of widespread vocal solidarity. It was overwhelming, a warm wave washing over the cold anger I'd carried for so long. An emotional catharsis began, slow and deep. It wasn't just about Morrison's downfall, it was about the lifting of a weight I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. 5 years of injustice, of feeling devalued and dismissed, was finally being acknowledged, rectified. The shame I'd felt over echoes in the silence began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet pride in my resilience. Quiet power move, I announced through Chloe, that any financial settlement reached in my legal actions against those who had plagiarized my work would be donated to a new fund to support debut authors facing unfair critical attacks or financial hardship. It wasn't about the money for me, it was about the principle, and about ensuring other young writers wouldn't have to endure what I did. The scandal, as the media now ubiquitously called it, sparked broader conversations within the literary community. Think pieces appeared, debating critical gatekeeping, the ethics of academic commentary on contemporary authors, and the power dynamics at play. It felt like a genuine shift, a crack in the old, calcified structures. I looked at myself in the mirror. The tired, haunted eyes that had stared back at me 5 years ago were gone. In their place was a woman I recognized, a woman I respected. I was no longer the vulnerable, easily wounded writer. I was a survivor, a fighter, and, it seemed, a catalyst. The professional triumph was undeniable. My publisher, Aurora, ecstatic with the way I'd handled the crisis and the ensuing positive publicity, announced a new 3-book deal. The figures were astronomical, cementing my place in the literary firmament. But even that felt secondary to the internal shift. I found my original dog-eared manuscript of Echoes in the Silence, the one Morrison had eviscerated. I touched the cover, the cheap paper, and for the first time, I didn't feel shame or pain. I felt a strange sort of affection for the young woman who had poured her heart into those pages, the young woman who had dared to dream. The metallic tang of blood in my mouth, a taste I'd associated with that humiliation for so long, was finally blessedly gone. Then, a week after Morrison's disastrous podcast appearance, a small, plain brown package arrived at my apartment. No return address, just my name, neatly typed. My heart gave a little lurch. Was this another threat? Another attack? With a sense of trepidation, I carefully sliced it open. Inside the mysterious package was a copy of my first novel, Echoes in the Silence. Not a new copy, but one that looked like it had been read many times. Its cover creased, its pages softened at the edges. Tucked inside the front cover was a single folded sheet of plain white paper. My breath caught in my throat. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. A short, handwritten note. You were right all along. Some of us just took too long to see it. Forgive an old fool's cowardice. It was signed, simply, a critic. No name, no further identification. Just that stark, humbling admission. I sank onto my sofa, the book and the note clutched in my hand. A critic? Which one? Whitmore? Sarah Chen? Someone else entirely, someone who had remained silent during the pile-on but had carried the guilt? It didn't matter. The anonymity of it, in a strange way, made it more powerful. It wasn't about one person's redemption. It was about a crack in the facade of critical infallibility. The faint, musty smell of the old book paper, a scent I once associated with failure, now seemed to whisper of a quiet, unexpected absolution. It was the first of several such ripples. In the weeks that followed, a few other critics, some prominent, some obscure, reached out not with public apologies but with private emails, messages passed through my agent, expressing regret for their earlier, harsher judgments of my work, admitting they had been swayed by the prevailing winds of Morrison's influence or their own biases. A cascade of quiet revelations. It wasn't a flood, but it was enough. Enough to know that genuine change, however slow, was possible. My case, the Maya Chen affair, as one literary journal dramatically dubbed it, became a catalyst. Industry roundtables were convened to discuss ethics and criticism. Universities began reviewing their guidelines for academic commentary on living authors. The conversation I had hoped for was happening, robust and challenging. It was a transformation I hadn't dared expect. Then came an invitation that brought the journey Zhenshchina full circle. The Dean of Arts and Humanities from Professor Morrison's former university, she had quietly resigned, for personal reasons, a few weeks after her suspension, contacted me. They were restructuring their creative writing program, aiming for a more inclusive, forward-thinking approach. They wanted to know if I would consider a position as a visiting professor to teach a masterclass on contemporary fiction. The irony was almost too perfect. To teach in the very halls where I had been humiliated, to occupy a position of authority once held by my chief tormentor. I accepted. The first day I walked into that classroom, not as a terrified student, but as the professor, was surreal. The room looked the same worn linoleum, the same humming fluorescent lights, the same faint smell of chalk dust and old ambitions. But I was different. As I stood before a new generation of hopeful, anxious faces, I felt a profound sense of responsibility. The sensory full circle was complete, yet entirely new. The air, instead of being thick with judgment, felt alive with possibility. Quiet power. Move. I dedicated my next book, the first in the new 3-book deal, to all the critics, past and present, who inadvertently helped me find my voice, and to the readers who always knew it was there. It was a subtle nod, a final turning of the tables, transforming their negativity into a footnote in my story of triumph. Professor Morrison, I heard through the literary grapevine, had retreated from public life entirely. There were rumors she'd moved to a small town, writing obscure academic papers under a pseudonym. Her reign was over. My legacy, however, was just beginning to be built. With a portion of my new advance, I established the Phoenix Feather Foundation, dedicated to providing grants and mentorship for debut authors facing critical persecution or struggling to get their unconventional voices heard. Standing there, in that classroom, a sense of personal peace settled over me, a calm I hadn't felt in years. The trauma of my first book's reception, the years of fighting, the sting of betrayal, it had all led me here. The pain, I realized, had been a necessary crucible, forging me into the writer and the woman I was now. The clock on the classroom wall showed I had 30 minutes before my first lecture was due to begin. I took a deep breath, arranging my notes on the lectern. The worn wood felt solid, reassuring under my hands. Just then, a nervous young woman, clutching a manuscript to her chest like a shield, approached me. Her eyes were wide, her expression a familiar mixture of hope and terror. "Dr. Chen?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I'm one of your students. Would you mind?" She gestured vaguely with the manuscript. I looked at her, and in her anxious face, her trembling hands, I saw myself at 25. A jolt, a shock of recognition. And in that instant, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was why I was here. The student, her name was Anya, ironically, pushed the manuscript towards me. It's my first novel. Some of the other students and one of the TAs, they said it's too commercial. Too plotted. Her voice cracked on the last word. I took the manuscript, its pages still warm from her nervous grip. I read the first page, then the second. The writing was raw, yes, a little unpolished, like Echo's had been. But it was alive. It had that spark, that undeniable connection to the reader's heart that no amount of academic theory could teach or discredit. I saw the raw talent there, and I saw the familiar shadows of peer criticism, the echoes of Morrison's old pronouncements trying to snuff it out. A protective instinct, fierce and immediate, surged through me. Anya, I said, my voice gentle but firm, let me tell you a story. And so, in the minutes before my first official lecture, I shared a condensed version of my own journey: the destruction, the secret writing, the resurrection, the confrontation. I saw understanding, then a dawning hope flicker in her eyes. I didn't just offer her advice, I offered her courage, the kind I had so desperately needed all those years ago. I vowed silently to shield these new writers, to nurture their authentic voices, to protect them from the kind of gatekeeping that had almost silenced me. The classroom began to fill. The sound of students' pens scratching in their notebooks as they jotted down thoughts, the murmur of excited conversations, the rustle of paper. It was the sound of creativity unfettered, freed from the fear of arbitrary judgment. The sensory resolution was complete. It wasn't the silence of a defeated enemy I cherished, but the vibrant noise of a new beginning. My greatest victory, I realized in that moment, wasn't revenge on Professor Morrison. It wasn't the bestseller lists or the lucrative contracts. It was this transformation, the ability to turn my pain into purpose. Quiet power move. As the students settled, I made an impromptu announcement. My next book, I said, a smile playing on my lips, won't be a novel. It will be a guide for writers on surviving criticism, finding your authentic voice, and navigating the often treacherous waters of the literary world. A legacy moment, I could see my influence rippling outwards, not as a method to be copied, but as an inspiration, a permission slip for a new generation of writers to be brave, to be true to themselves. The final emotional anchor settled into place. The warmth of purpose, of mentorship, of shared creation, finally, completely replaced the cold, aching void of old wounds. My story had come full circle, ending where it began, with teaching. But now, I stood on the other side of the lectern, armed not with dogma, but with hard-won wisdom, empathy, and the unshakable power of a voice that had refused to be silenced. The journey had been brutal, but the rebirth was glorious.